right, well, welcome to the Foundations of Biblical Life Experience Masterclass. So last week I mentioned we've started a series in this experience where we're talking about the distorted views we have of God. And somebody was nice enough to loan me a $100 bill. I made sure that they did get it back, just so you know, to talk about how do we understand when there's a counterfeit versus what's real. So over the next few weeks, we're going to continue to dig in. In terms of if you followed the first week, we did a lot of pages really quick and kind of overwhelmed it a little bit. But now we're slowing things back down a lot. So if we get through one distortion tonight, great. If we get through two, fine. But really, it's kind of be as we go, just as the conversation is in the room and etc. When you're in your groups, just make sure, I've been saying it to my group that's in here, but then there's a few people who, keep getting put into the other room randomly with it. When you're in your groups, just a couple quick thoughts. We do have a group's guidelines in our life groups packet, if you've ever looked at that. But the basics are that anything that's said in the group should stay in the group. You never want to come in on Sunday and you hear somebody talking about the thing you talked about on Thursday night that wasn't that person. And, even if it was that person, why are they talking about outside of that? So, make sure as you're sharing, just be aware of your impact and presence in the room on others too. And if you are more introverted, don't want to talk, I tend not to call on you. If I do, and you get a look like 1,000-yard stare of death, then I'll be like, actually, why don't we have, we'll kind of go from there. The other thing I mentioned was, while this is based largely on Dr. Sanders' work and some of the work that's come from Wendell Sutton, Dr. Sutton, Steve Seaton, and some others, there's a lot of my own work in the mix of this too. So this next couple weeks does more directly follow through with the book that I wrote a few years ago called Who Is This God Person Anyway? So if you would like to go deeper, like where there's kind of a half page on here of each distortion, there's a chapter on each distortion and then a chapter on each of the who God really is. And that's available on that same website I just mentioned, altitude.church/next. It's a free download. So it's not anything I'm selling or anything like that. It's just there for you for free. So tonight we're going to start by talking about God versus the ancient mummy of Pharaoh. So when you think about Pharaoh, what comes to mind? Whether it's from your religious background, whether it's from Charlton Heston movies, whatever it happens to be, what comes to mind? Control. Okay, how so?
Control of the masses.
Okay.
And their minds, really.
Okay. I like that answer. What else? Stubbornness? Yeah. Keeps hardening his heart. Yeah. Slavery. Yeah.
Absolute authority.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Plagues and punishment.
Okay. Arrogance. Yeah. That makes sense.
Build an entire pyramid.
Yeah. Built to their own glory. Unless you watch, if you've ever seen the show Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, it's wonderful because the answer, if you're in Sunday school, it's the answer is always Jesus. The answer on Ancient Aliens is obviously this is the work of aliens. And you're like, okay, cool. Well, I knew that was the answer, but it's kind of fun anyway. So when you think of Pharaoh, nobody used kind words, right? You use words that are dictatorial. You use words that are controlling, words that are angry. When you think of Pharaoh, a lot of us, especially if we're of a Judeo-Christian background, you probably go to the moment in the Exodus where Moses and the Israelites are being oppressed. And then, when Pharaoh gets mad, what does he say? He says, I'm going to make you work harder. You know how we've been providing you straw? That's not really fair. Now you have to go get your own straw and your quota is going to stay the same or get bigger as we go. So Pharaoh's that God, that leader, that ruler that you could never please. And conveniently, if you have watched Stargate or those type shows that kind of go back to that time, you do see that the pharaohs were pretty well considered gods. I mean, they were the embodiment of raw or, what have you. Similarly to the Caesars, we kind of talked about the Roman Empire a little bit last week, and similarly to that, the Caesars were seen as the son of God, right? So they're this leader that's strong, that's unrelenting, that's a taskmaster. The most modern comparison I can safely use is a football coach, right? So I was never on the football team. Surprise, surprise. I shared this story last week with someone, but back when I was in high school, you had to take a football module. So it was like a month or two where that's what you did in PE was you learned how to play football, you played football. And my buddy Jesse and I, we just had no interest in the sports ball. So when all of you are watching that thing this Sunday, I totally forgot that it even existed, not even lying. So what we would do is we made sure that we ended up on opposite teams. And I don't even know what you call the person who's in kind of the very back that they like, in baseball, it's like the right fielder. It's the one that you kind of like, yeah, you just go over there. You can stand there and pick daisies, right? So I was the right fielder in football, whatever that is. And my buddy Jesse was the left fielder, right fielder, whatever on that side. We always made sure we were right across from each other. And whenever they called the play and said hike, we had one objective and one alone. We ran at each other as hard as we possibly could. And the person who lost their footing lost the game. So everybody else was playing football. We were playing tackling dummy. That was our game, right? But I've been around enough people who have been a part of the foosball to know that there's certain coaches, certain leaders in that it just, whatever you do, it's never enough, right? And they'll tell you it's because, it's for your own good. I want to grow you. I want to see you achieve your full potential. But ultimately, at least the ones that I see on bad episodes of TV, the bad version of the coach is the one who cares about his own legacy, doesn't care about the kids at all. He just has an end goal in mind. And as long as you fit that end goal, you're valuable. But if you can't perform, his favor leaves you. Similarly, some of us have a view of God, whether we realize it or not, that matches up with the phrase, you have to give 110%. No matter what, mathematically, it's not. Unless you're pregnant and then the baby's given some and you're given some and then it counts, but prove it. But 110%, so this is the view of God where whatever we do for God, it's never enough. And we want to please him, so we keep trying harder and keep trying harder and keep trying harder. Trying to earn approval, validation, maybe even a caring word. But on the other side of that 110% or the other end of a cracked whip, it often feels like, well, you've been doing all this, but now I need you to do it and you need to go make your own straw, right? So it's this caricature of God rather than, how Jesus said, come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It's almost the opposite of that. It's the view of God where we have to keep earning God's favor. And the second we fall short, we're off the team, right? And just like the view last week we talked about of the cosmic cop version of God, there are hints of this that we just don't even realize. Remember we talked about how some of the things that we say and do just result from uncritical reflection on life. So stop me if you've heard this phrase, God helps those who help themselves, right? You have to earn your way. God will never give you more than you can handle. That's kind of the opposite of the Pharaoh God, but also equally a very destructive statement that oftentimes people say, oh, that's in the Bible somewhere. I know it, right? It's not, right? So the distortion of this is that we are sort of, come on in, Ron. Come on in, Joni. We are sort of seeing ourselves as God's slaves. Now, the irony is, the Bible does talk about us as bondservants. A bondservant was a very different thing than a slave. It was a doulos was the word. Slavery was very common in biblical times, and the Bible actually undercuts it in so many ways. It doesn't outright say, hey, this is the bad thing to do. It kind of keeps undermining it and keeps showing like, no, actually people do have value. No, actually this does. But one of the things they would have in those days was your doulos or your bondservant. And so if you were at the end of your time, 7 years as a slave, and you then were going to be set free, right? Which, by the way, that alone was revolutionary. Like, that was an undercutting of slavery. But if you loved your master so very much that you didn't want to leave, then they would put an awl through your ear and you would be kind of marked as a permanent bondservant. So it does say we are his bondservants, right? That we have a master who is so loving that we can come back to him and trust him. But it never points to a God who is always bearing down on our necks. And so the Pharaoh God, or the God of 110%, is the one who always demands more than we could ever possibly give and never understands why we can't comply. Now, spoilers, this is not the God as revealed in the Bible or the actions of the Spirit across history. However, I would be willing to bet that the more you start to introspect and the more you start to think about your own life, there are moments at least, if not outright seasons of your life, where that sort of defines what God maybe looked like or looks like for you. And so we want to kind of undo some of that understanding. So the God that's presented in Scripture, if the Bible is true, actually points to the reality that there is absolutely, positively nothing we can do to earn God's favor. In fact, Christianity, we're going to talk about this in another module of this as well, but Christianity differs from every single religion in the world in that every religion has at its foundation what you must do to earn heaven, to achieve nirvana, to ascend to a higher plane, to whatever language you want to put to it. There's always a list, and there's always gatekeepers of the list. Scripture, on the other hand, points to the fact that all have fallen short of the glory of God, that none of us can even begin to try to pay back the debt that we have earned. We're going to talk about this again in a few weeks as we start to talk about the fall and things. But the reality is the gulf is so wide and our bank accounts, so to speak, are so small, we could never, ever, ever, ever earn or achieve our way back to God. So if you've ever watched a show like The Good Place, it's a really fun show as long as you don't dig too deep into the theology of it. Ted Danson shows up and starts telling people that, if you did this, it was worth this many points positive, and if you did this bad thing, it was worth this many points negative, and as long as your good outweighs your bad, you get into the good place, right? That's actually not biblical at all. It says, by grace you are saved through faith in Jesus Christ. That's it. So the difference between the God of 110% and the God of the Bible, among many, is that this is the God who, instead of telling you to give 110%, literally gave everything for you. I'm going to mute for a sec so I can cough. Excuse me. So let's take a look then at what the Bible does talk about when it comes to God. And it talks about a God who is consistent with the person of Jesus Christ. So, there's a scripture there. If somebody would read it from the screen or from the booklet as loud as you can so the camera can pick it up here. Go ahead, Pam.
Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. Hebrews 1:1.
Thank you. It goes on in there then to say This Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature, sustaining all things by his word. So if you learn nothing else about God in this entire course, the most important thing you could learn right here in Hebrews is that God is represented exactly in the person of Jesus the Christ. So by the way, Jesus' last name isn't Christ, just in case. We're going to do a little bit of myth busting here tonight, but Christ is actually, Christos in the Greek is the title Messiah or Mashiach in the Hebrew. It's the term for Messiah. So when you say Jesus Christ, you're saying Jesus the Messiah. You're not saying Jesus of the family lineage of Christ, right? So Jesus the Messiah is the exact representation of the nature and character of God. He's also the central focus of the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. We're going to use a resource a lot in this experience called the Bible Project. One of the things they say in almost all of their videos is, we believe the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. Everything in the Old Testament, everything in the New Testament, Jesus is the center of the Bible. The very beginning of the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, he was with God in the beginning. So the Word is a Greek, kind of a Platonic dualism way that they would refer to like the creator. So the moving force, more technically. So all of this points to like Jesus was there in the beginning. Jesus is there at the end. Jesus is the center of the Bible. And Jesus is the exact representation of the nature and character of Yahweh. So what this means is, whenever you see Jesus doing anything in Scripture, that's the way God, Yahweh, would interact with us. So for example, how many here, see last time I did this, there's a really big Star Trek fan. I don't know, anybody Star Trek fans in here? Okay, we've got a couple at least. Now I got to narrow it down a little bit farther. The J.J. Abrams versions of Star Trek? None of you. Great. Okay, this is going to be a great example. So in the J.J. Abrams version of Star Trek, there's Captain Kirk, right? And they are trying to train him up because he's not captain yet. He's whatever, fleet officer or something like that. He's a what?
Young Chris Pine.
He's a young Chris Pine. That's right. The best Chris, right? The best Chris. So there's a young Chris Pine, William Shatner Jr. there, and they're trying to train him to be a Starfleet officer. So they have this scenario thing. They call it the Kobayashi Maru. It's literally designed to be an unwinnable scenario. Now, with that framework, go to the story of the woman caught in adultery. When these religious leaders bring this woman who caught in adultery, like literally means like they removed her while she's having this act happen, and she's probably at least maybe covered with a bed sheet or something like that, but that's probably about it. She's not in a state of, lipstick on and she's out in her nines looking good, right? She is in the worst possible moment she could possibly find herself in, because these religious leaders, who, by the way, didn't drag the man into this circle, they dragged her into this circle, and they tell Jesus, they say, okay, the law of God says that we must stone her. So what do you say, teacher? And I love it. It just says Jesus knelt down and just doodled in the sand. He's just like, I'm going to let you guys sit in this for just a moment and think about what you're doing here. But the idea was, if Jesus was proclaiming himself as this rabbi, this religious leader, and he let the woman go, he's breaking the law of God. But Jesus went around telling people to love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? He talked about setting captives free. He went around healing the sick and the downtrodden. He brought the dead back to life. And so they also know that if he condemns her to death, the crowds are going to go, oh, he's just another one of them. Just another one of those partisan, religious, politicking jerks. And so in their mind, they win, right? Because if Jesus says, yeah, stone her, I don't care, he's lost his following. But if he says, no, set her free, he's not the man he says that he's proclaimed to be. So if you've seen the Star Trek movie, right? Kirk went in beforehand and rewrote the program so that there was a winnable scenario. And they all got mad at him because they're like, you're supposed to lose. That's the whole point of this. And he's like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I wanted to win, so I did, right? So a little bit different as the analogy goes now, but Jesus just, stands up eventually, looks at them, and what does he say? He who is without sin cast the first stone. So he doesn't get caught on either side of the seesaw that we're going to talk about in several weeks. He kind of puts it back on them. And I love the text because it says, they walked away from the oldest to the youngest. Because the older we get, the more we're like, yeah, I'm the one who's screwed up. And the young ones are like, I'm perfect. What are you talking about? I got this. And then eventually they're like, never mind, right? Never mind. So Jesus wins the scenario. But then look at what he says to the woman afterwards. Because if you miss this, you miss everything in that. He goes up to her. Picture a woman who's been recently abused. I doubt that they carried her like an angel up to there before they were threatening to kill her, right? They're dragging her through the streets. They're abusing, hurling insults at her. She's standing in a state of almost nakedness, publicly about to be executed by the religious authorities. So I got to imagine she's shaking. She's frightened because as Jesus talks, like literally they're like, dude, you get to decide, is she going to die or not? And so the one who literally has got the power of life and death over you looks at her and says, does no one here condemn you? She says, none, sir. And then he says these words, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. So in all of that, you see this encapsulation of the heart of God for both justice and mercy, hand in hand. Wherever you see Jesus doing, you are seeing the heart and the attitude of God. So if you read the Gospels, and you start to realize, like, man, that guy that came up to Jesus and started talking about this or that woman who had a blood flow issue, the person who was worried about their sick child, I wonder what Jesus would do if I were that person. We kind of know, right? Think about how Jesus interacted with people. Now think about how he interacted with the religious leaders of the day, right? Oftentimes, there's this bad idea that Jesus was kind of like this heavenly Mr. Rogers running around, or maybe even Barney. They're bringing back Barney the dinosaur, by the way. Like, I don't know if you've seen that, if you have kids, but the I love you, you love me. Like, that's the way, like, Jesus is basically the Barney the dinosaur walking around going, hey, everybody. And then we get to the point where they murder him, and we're like, where did that come from, right? Whoa, that's weird. When in the reality, Jesus saved some of his harshest words for those who tried to oppress others, for those who didn't live as peacemakers, for those who looked at the foreigner or the widow, the orphan or the oppressed and said, they are the problem. And Jesus goes, no, child, you are the problem. He flipped tables, right? He did things that made people go, oh, what in the world is that? Like there was the Lion of Judah and the Lamb of God, both in one. So think about when the disciples come to him and they're like, hey, Jesus, we were talking the other day. And we think that a couple of us, we're the ones that should sit at your right hand when you come into your kingdom, which functionally is them saying like, hey, you know how Caesar has that right-hand man that has all the power? Like, yeah, we want that, baby. We want the power. We want the prestige. We want the glory. And we we think we narrowed it down to the three or two of us. What do you think, Jesus? And then Jesus takes that and turns it around and shows them what a servant is and washes their feet. So, everywhere you see Jesus responding to the humans that are around him, you're seeing Yahweh's character, then, now, and forever. So I want to challenge you, like, if you're not in a Bible reading plan, I always encourage people to start in the Gospels. I mean, the Bible's a weird book because you start in Genesis and you're like, woo, this is all exciting. And then you get to Leviticus and you're like, what do I do with mildew? What part of my house do I have to burn down? Oh my gosh. But if you start in the Gospels, you get to see Jesus. And then you work your way back to mildew laws. And I promise you, there's actually a lot of redemptive stuff in the names of the genealogy and the mildew laws, all that kind of stuff. But that is God's character towards us. So when you see it, you start to understand better who God is. That being said, we have to take a look at who Jesus really is. Because the reality is, we have a very specific view of Jesus oftentimes. Now, I don't know if you guys had this picture in your grandmother's house when you were growing up. I had that exact picture. It hung on the wall by the bathroom. So it was like when I walked out, Jesus was judging me of like, I'm sorry, sir, I hope you didn't see that. Like, right? And I just grew up with such an Americanized, Western-minded, white, beauty pageant Jesus that it wasn't until I got much older that I started to realize, like, oh, that's not like Jesus at all, right? So Jesus wasn't raised in a Western dominant setting. He wasn't Caucasian, just in case that throws anybody for a loop. He was, at the very least, olive-skinned. He probably didn't have long hair because it wouldn't have been traditional to wear it that style. He would have had a beard, but he would have been probably an olive-skinned, rugged-looking man. He was a carpenter. Actually, the word there that they use for carpenter actually could mean stonemason. So, like, he was either working with rocks or wood. And either way, like, that doesn't leave your hands pretty and your knuckles all nice looking and all that. There's even this verse in Isaiah that says he had no appearance that was pleasing to us. In other words, Jesus might have been ugly. Like, we don't think about ugly Jesus. We think about Swedish Jesus with his purple pageant sash that he won in Miss America AD 1, AD 30, whatever it was. Jesus was a first century ancient Near Eastern man. He was a Jew of Jewish descent. He was a Hebrew culturally. Like, all of these things start to paint the picture of a person that is often very different from the Jesus that we have concocted into our brains. But when we read about Jesus, like we've been talking about in the Sunday messages, right? What's the first question of discipleship? Not just, what does this mean, but what does this really mean? Because if you're going to understand Jesus, you have to put him back into the setting that he was in the mindset of the world that he was in. You have to give him back the culture that he was raised in. So back in 2020, when the thing was happening, y'all remember the thing. Yeah, that's right. He who shall not be named Pandemonium. Anyway, so we were all on lockdown, right? We're all doing meetings like this on our computers, and that's really where everything lives. And we were also at that time taking the Sloan's Lake Church and the Arvada Church and merging together to become Altitude Church, keeping this 138 and 60-year-old history intact, moving things forward. We're trying to do all these things while this pandemic thing is going on. And so I'm in Zoom meetings, because what else do you do then? I'm in Zoom meetings. And I'm in with these group of church planters. That was weird. Did a mouse run across the...
No, I
Okay, it was like all of the women just all of a sudden stood up briefly. It's like, that was crazy. So I'm on this Zoom call with a group of church planters, and one of them happens to be my friend who is of African American descent. John left the room. What happened here? Just saying. And he was the guy who was also not afraid to go, guys, you need to understand something. And so he was talking, because this was the race riots, and Denver was, one of the homes of these. And so he's trying to help us understand what it's like to be a black pastor in 2020's North America. And he just asked us a very simple question. He said, okay, just quick show of hands. When you picture Jesus and the disciples, how many of them are white? Only the black pastor could say this to us. It was like, all of them. Yes, all of them. In my head, through my raising, all of that, every one of them. He's like, so let's talk about Simon the Cyrene. Do you know what geographical region that would be? Yeah, that's northern Africa, right? So at least half of Jesus' disciples were olive at lightest, probably several of them African descent. Think about the man who carries the cross for Jesus. Think about Joseph of Arimathea, may very possibly. So like as I started to do this, I was like, oh my gosh, like, why does that matter? Well, we've learned a lot since 2020, and we've learned nothing since 2020, right? To understand racial differences is to understand the person. Because, we got really good at saying, I don't see color. And then my black friends were like, if you don't see color, you don't see me. Because that's a part of who I am. What you're saying when you say I don't see color is everybody should just be homogenous, right? Just everybody be the same. Everybody be white. Be whiter. You'll be okay. Well, Jesus wasn't. The disciples weren't. Jesus also didn't speak English. And I know this makes total sense. You have amazing timing, Jono. Okay. Did I offend you? Jesus also didn't speak English, which makes complete sense, right? Because you start thinking about it, and the culture of the day, there would have been multiple languages. At the very least, you would have had Hebrew, Koine Greek, and Aramaic. So it's highly likely that Jesus spoke mostly in Aramaic with some Hebrew, and then Greek would have been the lingua franca, literally the language of the day that people would have spoken, but it was like the trade language. It's like how everybody has to learn English now because it's the trade language, right? That's what we do business in. So he probably would not have spoken English. Well, he definitely wouldn't have. And he wouldn't have spoken anything like what Shakespeare did. So whenever you have somebody, and we can talk about this when we get to the Bible section here in a bit, but whenever you have somebody who says like the only version of the Bible that we're allowed to read is the King James Version because it's the original one, I'm like, let me just burst your bubble a little bit. King James wasn't around when King Jesus was walking the earth, right? And so that starts to mess with some people. It really starts to shift our brain. Jesus' way of speaking very deeply reflected the idioms, the cultural language, and the heritage and things that were going on of the day, which totally makes sense, right? Because we live that all the time. How many of you have gone back to watch a movie that was made in like the 1980s recently? Yeah. And how many times do you look at that, and maybe for some of us have kids in the room at the same time, and your kids are like, what the heck was that? And you're like, well, you see, back then, it was okay to call somebody that. Like, we all did it, right? And your kid's like, Dad, why are we watching this? There's, but you could go back and you could picture the sound of the 80s, right? Or the 90s, or the 2000s. Like, there's literally cultural differences to where if you dropped me now in this current mental body back into the world of Clueless or, Scarface or, whatever, like it's just a completely different world. Words mean different things. Phrases mean different things. And we've started to just adopt them. But we don't think, again, remember, how do we get a misinformed version of God? By uncritically reflecting on life. So, for example, there are things that we say every day that are horrifying, and you have no clue that they are. For example, the rule of thumb. Have you ever used the rule of thumb? Do you know what the rule of thumb is? You're not allowed to beat your wife with anything that is more substantial than the width of your thumb. That's the rule of thumb. But we're like, yeah, my rule of thumb with my kids is that they don't. And you're like, what? Wait. But see how the changing of language shapes what things mean? So when Jesus talked, he talked in a cultural language where sometimes, he'd say something, and as a white American, Western, postmodern person, you take it to just be like, oh, that's cool, that means this. And then you actually start unpacking what it actually meant. Like my wife, whenever we've been in life groups, and anytime we get to the part where it says, like, if somebody asks for your coat, give them 2. If somebody asks you to go a mile, go 2. Like, a lot of people have used that to justify, like, abuse, the God of 110%, right? But literally it was an act of spiritual rebellion. Because in the Roman world, they could require you to go 1 mile. So if you went 2, you were showing them up. You were slapping them in the face.
I'm not 100% sure that they even really understood the full meanings of what Jesus was saying, even for the day, because they were always confused by what he said. I think
Right.
it wasn't until the Holy Spirit came down that they fully understood the extent of it.
Yeah, that's true too. And I don't even just mean like the parables, things like that. Even when he was being direct with them, though, like if we were to hear it, it would mean a different thing. Like kind of how in the 1980s, bad went from meaning bad to meaning really good, which doesn't make sense. Right. So even in that, like the cultural idioms, like the way certain things were said, would have resonated with a person then, wouldn't have now. But yeah, I don't disagree. When Jesus spoke in parables, oftentimes they came up to him and said, wait, what did you mean? So Francis Chan and Preston Sprinkle wrote this passage, of all things, in their book Defending the Literal Existence of Hell, in Erasing Hell. They say this: deep down, we all have a tendency to recreate Jesus in our own image. Before we know it, we have an American Jesus, a Western Jesus, a postmodern Jesus, a hippie Jesus, a capitalistic or socialistic Jesus. Deep down in the heart of every person is a hidden desire to reinterpret Jesus in light of our own culture, political bent, or favorite theological belief. So, do I have a comment here first? Do I not finish the sentence? Sorry, apparently I'm missing some slides that I didn't create. My apologies on that. So in the book then it says, Jesus was a Jew who lived 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. He spoke Aramaic and also a bit of Greek, though probably with an accent. He didn't know a lick of English, let alone the Elizabethan King James Version. He was a blue-collar man who worked long, hard days as a woodworker or stonemason, and probably bore the physical features of a hard-working peasant. Dark, leathery skin, calloused hands, and a few scars from working in the shop. Jesus probably didn't have long hair because that wasn't typical of Jewish men of his day. And he certainly didn't have blue eyes, blonde hair, and milky skin. Jesus was a first century Jew, so we need to leave behind all of our Jesuses that have been refashioned and reshaped by our own cultural biases. Think about how that impacts something. Have you ever talked to someone on the phone and then met them later in person, and you're like, oh, you're nothing like what I imagined. We've been talking to Jesus on the white, Western American, postmodern, Eurocentric phone for a very long time. A hippie Jesus. Yeah, you missed the first part of that. So yeah, right there. So very recently, like this is a 1-year discipleship experience. It's amazing that you guys are all joining in on this. I recently started a 2-year discipleship experience called the Bema series. There is a podcast, Bema or Bema Rebooted. I'm dry. So Bema is by Marty Solomon, and there's a couple other guys that co-host with him, Brent Billingsley and a few others. So for those of you who maybe studied 20 years ago or so, the work of Ray Vanderlane. He's a guy who used to always take trips to the Middle East. He'd do videos showing like the historical sites and all that kind of stuff. So Marty Solomon was discipled by Ray Vanderlane. And so he talks about the process in there, and especially episode 0. So if you don't listen to anything else, listen to episode 0. There's also an episode -1. I don't know why they name these this way. -1 is like the introduction to the podcast. But episode 0 talks about the framework you have to begin to adapt to begin to understand Jesus in the proper context. And so he starts talking about things that the Hebrew mind and culture took for granted that we are just way on the opposite side of. So for example, while Greek was a very literal and precise language, Hebrew was very intentionally fluid and dynamic. So in Greek, the ending of a word literally tells you what case, what data, what it's in, like what function it performs in the sentence. Like the ending of a word tells you everything. It's like a library code, right? So in Greek, you can be laser specific. Hebrew was a lot more of a shotgun. And so he talks about like you go over to the Middle East even now, and you ask someone, tell me about God. I'm like, okay, God is like water. You're like, oh, cool, because like he flows and like there's the molecules, and they're like, whoa, no, God is like water. Okay, what do you mean? Think about water. Now think about God. God is like water. And the Western mind's like, help me help you. Let me dissect the sentence here and we can figure this out, right? Or it's very common to say God is like rock. God is a rock. That's the end of the sentence, by the way. That's what you're supposed to ponder on with God. The other thing is, like, we are really big on questions in the Western world, but we are just laser focused on finding the answer. The Hebrew mind was very focused on asking better questions. So Jesus is like this. Like, notice how people come up to Jesus and they're asking for an answer, and he gives them a question. And they're like, well, I don't know how to answer that. He's like, well, come back to me when you figured that one out. He's not being mean. He's not being rude. He's employing the common rabbinical style of the Midrash to say, there are better questions than your best answers. So when we think about Jesus, we often try to throw him into a box and say, I finally figured out. But remember, back to the first week we started talking about God, to say that we can know all there is to know about God is arrogant. But to say that we know nothing about God is foolish, because God is a God who desires to be known. But he wants to be known for who he really is. See, every political party that wants to pull something will tell you that they are the Jesus party. But they look nothing like Jesus. Every world movement that wants to try and get away with something will say, oh, we're just trying to be like Jesus, guys. The reality is, Jesus kind of gave us a metric. He said, if their life bears the fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, generosity, and self-control, that's when you know it's real. So when we talk about a couple sermon series from now, or actually, no, next sermon series, because wow, we're already in February. So next sermon series, we're going to start talking about the church's renewed focus on 3 words: more like Jesus. Because remember what we talked about last week? Like, I have nothing against rallies. I have nothing against, political actions, things like that try to influence people's hearts and minds. But the reality is it usually doesn't lead you closer to Jesus. If you want to change the world around you, when you become more like Jesus, when you start being a person of peace when everyone around you is shouting war, when you start being a person who's humble when everyone else is trying to tell you how many likes and swipe rights and views and all that stuff they've got, that changes the world. So I would recommend checking out the Bema podcast. It is very mind-bendingly different than what I have come to understand in here. So let me just ask you guys, open floor question. Why do you think it would be important to have a historical view of Jesus? Why do you think it would be important to consider the image you have of Jesus when you bring him to mind? Good.
Just like understanding more contextual parts of the story of Jesus, what he went through, like you said, the disciples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. John?
Similar to what he was saying, it's that understanding, like, I know my pastor to be tall, white, blonde hair, I know my wife to be white with brown hair, I know my daughter to be light skinned, or, it gives you context.
Right.
But also, if you wanna know somebody, you should know them,
Yeah,
right? On the most basic of ideas, you should know them.
you should know somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bob?
If we are to be more like Jesus, we need to know the Jesus that we are to be more like.
Yeah.
Because if we have that wrong image, then that image we are projecting as we be more like Jesus is wrong.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to
That's a
say.
good one.
Your words came out of his mouth. Go ahead.
It's also really important that, we know what the meaning of his words really are.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of complicated question because it's called the Living Bible for a reason.
Yeah.
And you get something different out of it every single time.
Yes. But if what you get out of it is, well, I think Jesus is telling me to go hate that person, you're not reading the same thing, or yeah. There's this, go ahead, Pam.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You got it.
Oh, I was just thinking, as Americans, I think sometimes we think we're all bad.
Yeah.
And that we're the only ones that can figure things out in the world. And
Yeah.
certainly Jesus was like us, looked like us. He must have looked like us. And,
Right.
so it's good for us to know that wasn't the case. And
Right.
to be able to see beyond our own skin.
Jamie?
I was just saying he looked completely opposite of Americans,
Yeah.
no?
Yeah. If you go over to the Middle East, you see a lot of olive-skinned. That's where Jesus would have been. If you go over, you see a lot of different culture. Now, even just think about some of the things that are absolutely obvious until you don't realize how they're not obvious to you anymore. Like, Jesus didn't have indoor plumbing. There weren't roads that cars drove on. So like when Jesus goes to wash the disciples' feet, we also picture American feet. They're clean, they're pedicured, they're taken care of. They wore something closer to sandals and walked on Roman roads that, by the way, are still really solidly intact, where ours are falling apart. But then again, they were designed for pack animals. Ours were designed for vroom vroom. So it's a little bit different thing. But those same pack animals that walked on the road, have you ever been in a parade? Have you ever followed the horses and you're marching behind and you're like, oh, just going to dodge those? So the things that would have gotten on their feet would have been gross, right? Not just like, oh, let me take off my sock, but it's a little sweaty. It'll stink a little bit. Like, when Jesus bowed down to wash the disciples' feet, he was washing muck and mud and scrapes and sores and gross and fungus. They didn't have Dr. Scholl's back then, that's what I'm saying, right? So you start to think of these things and you're like, oh, that does start to paint a different picture. And I'm not saying everything you've ever known about Jesus is wrong. I'm just saying the lens through which you have seen Jesus is a little bit dusty. But here's why this really starts to matter in other ways. Right now, in particular, although it's waning some, like it's very, very popular right now for people to walk away from their faith. And, the more you start to listen to deconstruction, first of all, like we did a series on deconstruction a couple years ago and just said, like, deconstructing your faith is healthy if you reconstruct it again. If you just leave it in shambles, okay. In fact, what we talked about at the beginning of this, it would be better for you to go back than to keep continuing on towards a caricature of God. So that side of it can be healthy. It can be good. But oftentimes when people are walking away and deconstructing their faith, what they're deconstructing is this deeply 1950s Americana that kind of took over and became what we understand about Jesus. So again, the Bema podcast, or Bema, if you get a chance to go through it, it's a very long, very long podcast. Every episode's an hour, and they get through about 3 verses. They start in Genesis and keep going. So, I mean, it's incredible. But you start to hear like how, when certain things are said, like this weekend, in fact, we're going to talk about a thing in Genesis that will change how you see the husband-wife relationship. That was just automatically understood because of the language that was used in that culture. Versus now we look back and we're like, whatever, don't know what that is. Gonna read past it, right? So the 3 questions of discipleship. What does this mean? What does this really mean? Well, at the very least, it means that we probably have some misunderstandings in our understanding of Jesus. Not saying everything that you've ever learned about Jesus is wrong. I'm just saying if you're looking at through a Western Eurocentric lens, you're not seeing the Middle Eastern, ancient Near Eastern Savior. Also, there are certain things that we were raised in that had more of a political agenda than a Jesus agenda. And honestly, I don't care which side of the political aisle you use, because both sides look nothing like Jesus, and both have perverted the way of Jesus. It's almost like Jesus was weaponized to bring people into conformity, and yet the real Jesus was literally a rebel.
Yeah.
Like literally, like again, you don't crucify Mr. Rogers. You don't crucify Barney the dinosaur for going around and telling people to love one another. They crucified political revolutionaries. That's where Jesus fell. And the more we have just been sanitized to, I mean, some of it's just familiarity. We just know these passages and what they say, but we don't know the passages. We don't dig into what they're actually saying. So what does this mean for my life? That's the question you start asking yourself. If you start to recognize that your Jesus looks very little like what the scripture presents, I would really challenge you. Like I know some people, they try to do the Bible in a year. I'm doing a Bible in a year plan right now. I would honestly say that you would get more and better out of it to read the book of John every single day this year and never leave the book of John than to go through the entire Bible in a year. The entire Bible in a year is great, but the more you start to learn about Jesus, the more you start to dig in. That's why I like the Bema podcast, because they're spending months in Genesis. But by the time you're done, you're like, wow, I missed so much, right? All I'm saying is we've missed so much when it comes to the person of Jesus. And the reason this is important, the why behind the why, is Hebrews chapter 1. Right back here on page 35. He is the exact representation of the nature and character of God. So if that is true, if this is true, then we had better take a look at who Jesus really is. Because to get that wrong skews everything else. So that's it for this portion of it. We're going to break into our groups. I'm going to end the video here. Thank you all for joining online. Hopefully this angle works a lot better for you. I have to find my mouse across the screens. All right.